So this may be the most boring opening ever. I can't tell whether we're starting. Can't hear anything. It looks like from the tiny little picture that I might be visible to everybody. Everybody's waving. You can hear me. Okay, well, I'll just assume we're good to go then. Awesome. Okay, well, first of all, thank you for your just your graciousness. I want to thank the film festival. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I love coming to the film fest, and it was a personal situation I won't go into. One advantage of this is the same technology that allows a guy in a Airbnb cabin in the middle of the mountains in Arkansas to zoom in. Also brings you Shiloh and Coco sitting here next to me, who've been in the car for a day and a half and are bouncing off the walls. So I decided if they would be quiet for this, I'd let them sit here right next to me. So we're talking about the 5 elements of story. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. I want to begin with one of my favorite stories from the 9th century, I believe, in Persia. This is an old story, and it's just got many applications, but in particular, I think it applies to what we're talking about today. So there's this boy from a poor village who is allowed every weekend to go into the local village area where they had a bazaar, and they're too poor to buy anything, but it's something different than just the rural life that he was used to. So once a week he'd be able to go in if he got his chores done, and he could look at the colored fabrics and smell the spicy foods and the aroma of the cinnamon in the bakery, and often there would be brass things for sale. And one day he was allowed to go in, but he was running a little bit late. It took him longer to get his chores done. And by the time he got to the village, he realized that the show, so to speak, of a traveling magician was just about to end. So this magician was in town, and he was doing a performance for all these villagers, and he calls the young people to come forward. And our little protagonist, our hero, is too far away to actually see this part, but he gets there right as the crowd is closing in around them. And the magician says, "Now for my last trick," and he holds up his finger, and his finger starts to glow. And then he reaches down and he touches a single pebble in front of each of the village children until it turns to gold. And when it turns to gold, he hands it to them, still warm. And they, of course, are delighted, and the whole crowd, applauds. And he says, "Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very, very nice to meet all of you." And he starts putting his things away. The crowd disperses. And after a couple of minutes, is that feeling that he's being watched. He turns around, and here's our hero staring at him, because of course he got nothing. And the magician looks at him and says, "You must have come late. I don't recognize your face. I'll tell you what. Give me a pebble." And so the boy brings him a pebble. The magician holds his finger up again until it starts to glow, and he touches the pebble, turns it to gold, hands it to the boy, and says, "There you go. Now you got what everybody else got." And the boy says, "Well, thank you, sir, but well, but what?" And he says, "But I want more." And the magician says, "Oh, okay, I'll tell you what, give me a stick." So the boy runs off and brings back a stick to him, and the magician holds up his finger again until it glows, and then he touches the stick, and this time it takes a little bit longer. But after a little while, the whole stick is gold. He gives it to the boy, and he says, "Be careful with that." The boy says, "Oh, thank you, sir, thank you. But what? But I want more." All right, that's twice he's asked, right? The magician thinks, "I'll get rid of him." So he says, go get me a brick from that crumbling wall over there." And the boy does, brings it back, lugs it down, sets it in front of him. The magician holds up his finger till it glows, touches the brick. This time it takes a couple of minutes. But before he's done, the entire brick is solid gold. And he picks it up and he hands it to the boy, extremely heavy. And he says, "Now listen, do not be a fool. Take that home. That will provide for your family for a year or more." And the boy says, "Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. But..." The magician says, "But what? I've given you a golden pebble, a golden stick, a golden brick. What more could you possibly want?" And the boy says, "Sir, I want the magic finger." I love that story because I sometimes use it in writing classes, but I think it's particularly appropriate when talking to screenwriters and filmmakers. It's possible to love stories and not love making them. It's possible to love the consequences or the fruit of something and not appreciate the difficult work that goes into it. And so I think that a lot of our culture is like that. We want to consume stories. We have more now than we've ever had, but we don't always see what's happening behind the scenes. And it's not enough, I think, to want to make a great movie. I think there has to be some sense in which we want to tell a great story. Our brains are wired for stories. It's just amazing. I won't spend a lot of time on this because I don't want to make this about me, but I have to give you a little bit of background why I teach on this particular thing. I have a master's degree in creative writing that I got at a secular school. It was miserable experience in some ways and a wonderful experience in others. But I had the good fortune of studying with an atheist science fiction writer for about 8 years. Took every class that he had, and he was great at story. Now, he didn't always, in fact, most of the time, he didn't say what it was that he was doing. He didn't point to the principles, but he sort of implied that there were principles to all of this stuff. He would read something and he would say, well, the problem with the story is that you started story A and you ended story B. And that doesn't work. The audience can't see the connection between A and B. And I would leave those classes thinking, what is it that he's talking about? Because everybody else in the English department at the State University, Kansas University, they taught word photography. They taught that there was something about the way you put your words together. It took me years after graduate school to realize that the essential problem was that if you don't believe there's an inherent meaning in the universe, there's something ultimately meaningful that holds everything together. What are you going to make your stories about? Stories are buckets for meaning. And so it was a process for me of decades, honestly, of searching for what is this thing. And I started to get the idea that there's actually another kind of language that human beings have used the world over, across civilizations and across time, across cultures. And our stories are essentially the same from one age to the next and from one culture to the next. In fact, one odd example of this is the story of Cinderella, which appears all around the world. There's actually a Cinderella story that was here in North America that a Native American tribe had, only it was reversed a little bit. It was the little ash boy instead of the ash girl, Cinderella. But they come over here with no contact with Europe, and there's the little ash boy Cinderella story. So what's going on with this? Well, there's a language. Our brains are wired for this, and understanding how that language works is important. It's important to telling a good story, right? We need to know what it is we're trying to do. So when I got to the point that I was willing to say, I spent 8 years studying creative writing, and I don't know what a story is. I actually don't know what a story is. I mean, I can point to it and say that's a story and that's not. But how would I simplify this, and how would I understand it? And I'm not sure how to stress this enough, but the key thing for me was just admitting that I didn't know anything, saying I don't know anything about the story. I've consumed thousands and thousands of these, and I don't actually know how they work. And when I did that, when I would say humbled myself and just said, Lord, I want to learn. Will you teach me? I began to look anywhere and everywhere to understand what makes a story a story. So hopefully you can see these. When you sit down in a movie theater seat, you have expectations that you're going to experience something. And I would say if you get these 5 things, you will go away from your experience saying that was a story. Now, it could be a bad story, but you'll recognize it as a story. But I have had the experience of sitting down to watch a film, and I thought, I'm not sure that was actually a story. And what I'm trying to get across is that there are 5 elements of story that are different than the 5 elements of literature you probably got when you were in junior high or high school. If you remember characterization, plot, setting, theme, style, sometimes voice, they would add to that. Those are great tools of analysis to look at something that already exists, but they're not very good for creativity. I'm pretty sure very few great works have been written because someone like Mark Twain sat down and went, characterization, plot, setting, theme. I don't think that's the way it works. I think C.S. Lewis talks about this a little bit, that creative types begin with images, with feelings, the things that are not quite easily containable in words. And somehow you have to find a way, if you're writing or if you're creating a movie, of capturing those things in a way that feels fulfilling. So the 5 elements of story, I would say, are the creative elements. Are, instead of being a microscope, a characterization, plot setting, theme, and style, we're drilling into something and zooming in and looking down on it. They're more like a telescope, where you're actually looking up. You turn that lens around, and you end up with this series of 5 things. Basically, every story, at least long form stories, and most anecdotes as well, will have someone to care about. They'll have something to want. They'll have something to dread, something to suffer, and something to learn. Now, I'm going to go through these. I'm going to try to unpack these as we go along. That's what this class is about. Because if you understand these 5 things and how to create them, it's not enough to know that these 5 things are the creative elements of story. We need to actually look at them like, well, how do I do that then? How do I get the audience to care about my protagonist, about my hero? So that's the question. And the first answer is actually probably, you can say, the oldest one that we can point to, which is undeserved misfortune. Your protagonist, the hero of your story, is the victim of something that they don't deserve. This is why fairy tales often begin with some phrase that's something like, an orphan went off to seek his fortune. Because as an audience, we will understand, we just take it for granted, no child deserves to have their parents killed. It's a terrible way to be brought into the world, right? The terrible thing to experience. It's why out of all the feature films that Disney did as flat animation, there's a few exceptions later on, but going all the way back to their early history of the feature films, only 2 of them have protagonists whose parents are both alive by the end. Now, Disney knew what they were doing. I'm not so sure they do now, if I'm allowed to say that, but they knew what they were doing when they were creating these story arcs. And you can, if I just say the film Bambi, you probably are all thinking of the same scene, right? There's undeserved misfortune that's part of that. This doesn't mean that your character has to be run over by, a truck or something in the first scene. It just means there's something that's undeserved that's going on, some kind of misfortune. It can't be deserved misfortune, because that's called justice. We won't be on the side of someone who's being, hanged if we find out that they're a Nazi prison camp guard or something, right? We're not going to feel sorry for them. So this undeserved misfortune idea is probably the oldest one, and it's one you can capture, and you'll see in many, many films. If you do any study on this, you just look for where's the element of undeserved misfortune. There's something in here. I shall also point out that I'm going to put up several techniques for this, but not every story should use all of them. If you start piling technique upon technique, what will happen is the audience will feel like you're trying to manipulate them. They'll see the wires behind the stage. They'll start looking for them, and you don't want that. What you want is for the protagonist to feel like he or she is getting a raw deal, right? Something has happened, and it's just and the tricky thing about this, it's difficult as a Christian in using these techniques, is that they can be very manipulative. They're intended to be manipulative, and this first one essentially places the moral compass in the center of the protagonist, so that we will start to see opposition to the protagonist as villainous. Sort of like when you want that last spot in the grocery store parking lot, and someone pulls in there, even though you got your blinker on, you kind of turn them into a villain. We do this politically all the time, but it's a temptation we need to be careful to understand as storytellers, if we're going to proceed with some moral integrity in terms of the stories that we tell. So that's the first one, undeserved misfortune. The second one is power. And I would specifically say power with humility. We're drawn to power. It's one of the creepiest things about human beings. We're drawn to power. We love power. We admire principle, but we admire it from a distance. meaning we admire it more when we see it in someone else because we know it's hard. And so when you give someone a power, some kind of, and let me slow down here. The power does not have to be a superpower, though it can be. Marvel movies do this all the time, right? You've got, well, in DC, any of the sort of the last 20 years of Spider-Man and Iron Man and you know, there's, I don't know how many there are now. I've lost track. But we're drawn to that sense because it's kind of cool. We're living vicariously through the hero. And the problem is if it's just power and there's no humility attached to it, we will quickly start to resent it internally and unconsciously. One of my favorite examples of this is the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer, which is about a boy who's just incredibly good at chess. That's his superpower. He watches these guys in the park play. He sort of figures it out. His mind is wired for chess, and it's based on a true story. And the thing that makes it so charming is that the boy's humility is more powerful than his superpower at chess. He actually lets other kids lose. I mean, lets other kids win because he doesn't want them to feel badly about losing. And you know, as he's being trained to be like an international champion at this young age, the guy who's training him gets really frustrated about this. Like, why are you doing this? You know, no, you can't. Do not make bad habits. You know, don't do that. But we, of course, in the audience are drawn to it because what we see is power with humility. Third one is morality, and this is where every film does this. Every single film uses a moral compass to get across something about the main character. So let's say you're watching a film and it opens with someone walking down an alley and you hear a little barking sound, and the person walking down the alley goes over and he sees there's basically a newborn puppy there in the rain crying, you know, no mom, no dog around, no other puppies. He's like, oh, so there's a little puppy down there, and he just boots it into a brick wall. You're probably revolted. Internally, there's something in you that is like, that is so wrong. Why would you do that, right? So now along comes somebody else in a great hurry, and he hears the sound of the puppy now crying, and he goes over to it, and what's he gonna do, right? You know, maybe he's late for work. Maybe he's been told, you know, if you're late again, no job. Maybe he has no money, but what does he do? He takes it to a vet, pulls out a credit card, hoping he has enough, you know, money left under the cap that he can pay for this puppy. Whose side are we on, right? We're on the side of the person with the moral compass. And the moral aspect here is quite simple. One person went out of his way to harm something innocent. The other person went out of his way to help something innocent and in need. And it's that simple. And now it doesn't have to stay that simple. But when I say that someone to care about is almost always going to be based on something moral, it's this idea that you show me someone who is acting moral under difficult circumstances, and I will project a moral compass onto them. And it's probably the trickiest one. And this is the one where we end up being turned off by a lot of modern films that will put the moral compass inside a hero who's then not just flawed, but flawed in a way that's trying to show us that what we know is evil is actually good. And this is one of the things that Hollywood has done. I don't want to get on like a soapbox and give a sermon about it, but it's one of the things that's frustrating is watching great technique present terrible ideas. But just that it's being used for a terrible idea doesn't mean the technique is bad, right? Okay, the fourth one is humor. And humor is pretty obvious. Not everybody can write humor. Humor is extremely difficult to write. But you can get the audience on the side of a main character, of a protagonist, without making them the victim of undeserved misfortune, without giving them a great superpower coupled with humility and without morality. So that's more difficult. But if you just make them funny and possibly give them a little bit on the good side, so to speak, we're probably going to be drawn to them. For instance, my favorite story about any president is a story about not Abraham Lincoln, but about President Taft. So when I say Taft, people go, we have a president named Taft? Yeah, we had a president named Taft. All anybody remembers is that he was a large man. He weighed about 350 pounds. What's important to the story is that he had a political enemy named Chauncey Depew, who was a senator from New York. And one night at a dinner party, surrounded by guests, Chauncey Depew pointed at President Taft's stomach and said, "What are you going to name the baby?" And Taft, without missing a beat, said, "If it's a boy, Junior. If it's a girl, Helen. But if, as I suspect, it's nothing but gas, I shall call it Chauncey Depew." It's kind of hard not to like President Taft after you hear that story. And we have unfulfilled desire, and this is I guess maybe I can call it a classic story, a Christmas story with a little kid who wants a Red Ryder BB gun. You guys seen the Red Ryder BB gun movie? With all along the way, he's told, "You'll shoot your eye out," right? Even if you don't like guns, if you don't like BB guns, if you don't think kids should have guns, even in that case, when you watch that film, at some point you just kind of want the kid to have the BB gun. And the reason is this: we all have unfulfilled desires. No matter how much wealth and power and privilege you have, how much prestige you have, how many awards, how many accolades, how many followers, how many likes, none of that stuff means that you won't have unfulfilled desires. And we all know that. So when we see someone else with an unfulfilled desire, it's basically easier just to connect with them as a human being. You'd say, "Oh, they are human. They're sort of like me in that regard." All right, so that's someone to care about, and that's probably the most important aspect of this, because as James Gunn used to say, James Gunn being the science fiction writer, not the filmmaker, you can't make a story about a gun. You can make a story about a man with a gun, or a person with a gun. So every story needs a person, whether the person is a car, as in the Pixar movie Cars. That movie's peopled with people in the shape of cars, right? So you gotta start there. Then you need something to want, and this is, believe it or not, this may be the most often overlooked of the 5 elements in stories where people, especially, are starting out. You can actually have the story goal and know that it's there as a writer, as a filmmaker, and not realize that you're not communicating it to your audience. The essential thing about something to want is that we need to know what we're hoping for. We need to know when the story is over, not just because the credits are rolling. In order to produce that sense of fulfillment, there has to be something that we're saying, "I really want that to happen." But it may not happen, right? So I call it something to want, but another term for it is the story goal. And the story goal is Lord of the Rings. I use a lot as an example. The Peter Jackson films, not The Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and Return of the King. Just because so many people have seen those films, those movies, if you watch the director's cut, take, I don't remember now, what is it, 12 and a half hours, something like that, to watch all 3 of them. And they're actually designed around a simple story goal that comes from Tolkien's books. And the story goal in Lord of the Rings is for Frodo Baggins to go to Mordor and drop the Ring of Power into the volcano where it was made, right? And this actually is said to us explicitly in the middle of the first movie, in the middle of the Fellowship of the Ring, in the Council of Elrond. There is a scene, you can probably picture it if you've watched the films more than once, where they're arguing and Gimli tries to destroy the ring with his axe, right? And the axe just shatters, and he's knocked backwards. And Elrond says, "The ring cannot be destroyed by any power we here possess. It must be taken deep into Mordor and cast back into the fiery chasm from whence it came. One of you must do this." Now, I love that because it's a single line, right? You could say a single line, maybe two sentences. I haven't looked at the screenplay in a long time, but it's those words strung together. And what they do is they create in us, in the audience, an expectation that we're going to see Frodo Baggins walk up to the edge of a volcano with my let me put my dog down here. Just my prop. This is my wedding ring, not the ring of power. But he's going to walk up to Mount Doom and he's just going to drop it in, right? So that's what we see. Your brain gets this image, this expectation of Frodo Baggins going up to the side of a volcano and going plunk. And all of the tension that's built up from every battle, from every relationship that forms, from the side characters, the kind of torturous scenes, the ring rates, everything in those films is about opposing Frodo going plunk. That's what it's about. Now, I don't want to give spoilers, but this is a perfect example because Tolkien was a genius. It's a perfect example of what I'm going to say next, which is that what happens? Is that what happens? Let me back up real quick and just say that the best story goals are usually presented as images that can be captured in a single shot or a single frame, or you can say like maybe 2 or 3 seconds, a single action. But you could capture that if you could picture Frodo standing in the ledge overlooking the volcano and doing this with the ring, maybe halfway down, something right there. Say that's the story goal. That's what we want to see. For a lot of people, the story goal, the single photographable act of their college career is walking across the stage and getting a diploma. What they're actually working towards is the single photographable act of tossing their little hat in the air and holding that piece of paper. And if you just took a snapshot of that, you could say this is the story goal of something like at least half of the kids who start out of college. That's what they're going for. They're living a story with that in mind. And that's why we can do it in the audience. We see that thing and we understand the importance of it. You can't just make up something and say, well, it's important just because. Just go with me on this. Trust me, it's important. We need to understand it, understand the consequences of failure, etc. But in Lord of the Rings, that has been established as the story goal, a single photographable act. And the remarkable thing is, of course, if you've watched the films, that particular thing does not happen that way, right? So again, I don't want to give spoilers, but we need to understand what's at stake, and we need to understand. Well, let me back up just a second because I want to hit that point a little bit more. The best resolutions of story goals are when you get the thing you're expecting, but not the way you expect it. So you end up with the ring in the fiery chasm of Mount Doom, but without the picture, or the picture that we've had earlier is changed somehow. And then it has to produce this kind of feeling, even if it doesn't produce this exact thought. The audience should be feeling, I should have seen that coming, but I didn't. Because the I should have seen that coming means that you set it up. It means that all the pieces were there for them to infer what could happen. And the but I didn't means that they were hidden enough that your audience can feel satisfied at the surprise of it. Almost every third act, the showdown of a third act, is almost always going to hinge on a revelation coupled with a surprise. So some kind of surprising thing we did not see coming. Where did that come from? And sometimes, because that's true in the language of story, sometimes writers make the mistake of going for the surprise element, and they forget that they need to set it up. You can't just say, surprise, look, hey, there's friendly paratroopers dropping out of the sky. Well, that was sure convenient. No, you don't want to do that. You want it to be, I should have seen that coming, right? Which again, Lord of the Rings is a really good example of that. So conflict is essentially the driving element. Now, so we're on the third element, something to dread. Sometimes people say, well, I don't really want something to dread in my stories, but you really, your brain is wired for storytelling, which means that it's wired to understand that there is opposition. And that's what this is getting to. There's opposition, and generally from anywhere from the first scene, the inciting incident, to the showdown, but especially in that second act, which is about 50% of your movie. In most films, 3-act structures is 50% of the story. Most of that is about opposition. So it's about conflict. And conflict, when it's described in, let's say, creative writing classes, we'll spend a lot of time using jargon, or what I think of as jargon. It took me getting out of college to understand what they were saying when they said internal and external conflict. I never went, okay, I know the concept, I know what you're saying, but how does this help me? And it took me, for myself, it took me looking at it from different angles and looking at taking apart things like novels and movies and saying, where's the conflict coming from, and why does it matter? To recognize that what's really going on with conflict, at least from the creative side, is that every scene is going to be structured as either a disaster or as a dilemma. A disaster being an external conflict. The hero's trying to get something and something gets in the way. The little boy wants to win the race and his shoelace, he trips over his shoelaces or something. There's a disaster that happens there. Or a dilemma, which is the internal conflict, right? You're at odds with yourself. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Ebenezer Scrooge. You're wanting this thing, or let me say it this way. You want to avoid this thing, but you also want to avoid this thing. Great dilemmas in stories are negative dilemmas. They're decisions between two negative options, things you do not want to happen. And here's why. We don't care if the choice is between, let's say, a poke in the eye with a pointy stick or a hot fudge sundae, because that's not a dilemma. It's not a dilemma. If you don't pick the hot fudge sundae, there's something, like you're not a hero anymore, protagonist. You're some strange being that isn't human, right? And we don't really care if it's a hot fudge sundae or a chocolate malt. Okay, so enjoy yourself, right? No big deal. What we care about is when, okay, do you save your son or your daughter? All of a sudden, it's difficult, right? We'll get into more of this a little bit later on, but in fact, if you're not looking at your scenes as being containers for conflict, when you write, then you're missing out on an opportunity to make your screenplay better. And that's not like, hey, you should be doing it the way I do it. I'm not saying that. I'm saying you're probably missing an essential element of drama in a scene if you can't point to it and say the essential conflict is grounded in either what bad thing happens, or what terrible decision does somebody have to make. Or here's another way of looking at it. Every scene in your story is going to have a moment that's like the breaking of a stick. There's that tension where you're like, it's being, harder and harder and harder, and all of a sudden, snap, something breaks. That snap is the climactic moment of the scene. If there's not a snap sound, sort of, figuratively speaking, to a scene, then you might need to go back on it and say, okay, I meant for there to be one, but why am I avoiding it? And oftentimes it's because the writer's avoiding the conflict. And here's the difficult truth. As human beings, most of us, if you're a decent person, you don't want to go around causing conflict most of the time, right? There are a few exceptions, but as a writer, your job is to look at something and make it dramatic, and it's dramatic through conflict. So if you're avoiding, which is what happens, you're avoiding the conflict, you're actually avoiding the story, because you're avoiding the dramatic nature, the backbone of the thing. I won't spend any more time on that. Suspense is the stick where we don't know when it's going to break, but we expect it to break, right? You warn your audience something bad is about to happen, and then you postpone it. Suspense is the thing that the longer you leave it there, the more it builds, right? The ticking bomb under the theater seat, so to speak. The suspense grows because we know it's coming. The Man Who Knew Too Much, isn't that am I getting that title straight? Alfred Hitchcock had a movie where the sniper was going to shoot at a certain point when there's cymbals clash in an orchestra, and so the sniper's up in a balcony behind some curtains, and we've been told when it's going to happen because Peter Lorre plays the actual music on a record player, and he's like, there's the moment you do it. And so this incredible amount of suspense that Hitchcock gets in that scene, because we've already heard the music and we know when the gun's supposed to be fired. And so we're seeing people in the theater oblivious, and we're seeing one person who knows, right? Looking around, going, where's the sniper? How do I stop this? And as the music gets closer and closer and closer, you know that it's the stick gets closer to breaking, but it still doesn't break yet. The moment it breaks, the suspense is over. So that's good storytelling, is the timing of all of this as well. And then dreadful promises and the villain. A dreadful promise is just saying that there's a bad thing around the corner, and then being, let's say, honest about it. So again, going back to Fellowship of the Ring, let's say Gandalf says some line like, "No, I would not go through the mines of Moria unless there were no other way." Well, as a storyteller, if you hear a character say that, that is the clue that they are definitely 100% for sure going through the mines of Moria. Otherwise, don't put it in. Then the audience hears that and they get it unconsciously, right? They know mines of Moria, bad, really bad. Okay, hope we don't go there, but you know, of course they're going to go there, right? Now, if Tolkien, if the filmmakers had decided, we want to keep Gandalf around a lot longer for the middle part of this scene, could have made a mistake here. And this is a mistake that a lot of writers make when they're figuring out how this stuff works. You know, you don't want to create a dreadful promise and then have the dread be oversold proportionally. You know, you're telling everybody there's a giant spider around the corner, and you get there and it's a tarantula. And it's, I mean, I guess giant compared to other spiders, but you know, if you led us to believe that it's the size of a house and it's a tarantula, we're going to be a little disappointed, right? So if you say, I would not go through the mines of Moria unless there were no other way, and then you get the sleeper in the pool, the giant spider-looking water creature with the weird face and the tentacles and all of that, right? And then, oh, there's nobody in there to greet him. And then, oh, it's all been taken over by these goblins, and they know we're here, and there's the drums and the deep, and right? Can you remember this stuff? This is why you wouldn't go through the mines of Moria. No, it's not. Nope. The Balrog is why you wouldn't go through the mines of Moria. And when the Balrog comes and Gandalf says, "This foe is beyond any of you, run," that's the payoff for the dreadful promise. The thing that we're saying we don't want to encounter isn't 10 feet tall, it's 100 feet tall, or whatever, right? So figuratively speaking, you have to be honest with your audience and pay off your dreadful promises, because then the next time you give them a little hint at something, they're gonna, you know, we don't want to make our audiences anxious, but we do in some ways, right? We want people to be wondering what's going to happen next. And the reason why is because if there's no sense of doubt about the outcome, the story won't be fulfilling. It won't have what Tolkien called a eucatastrophe, a catastrophe, but in reverse, something delightfully wonderful that happens in an unexpected way. We will expect it. Therefore, the eucatastrophe is not possible. So, and then the last thing on the slide here is the villain, which is just, the villain is the embodiment basically of a negative ideal of a story. So now we're at something to suffer, and this is the element that often when people say, "I'm not sure I agree with the suffering thing," because in life we're not looking to suffer. We're usually looking for more comfort than we are suffering, right? Even to our own detriment sometimes. There's different ways of producing suffering, but in fiction as well as in screenplays, physical pain is very difficult to encounter in other people. Most of us tend to be empathetic in some ways, and we see someone hurting. This is why I don't like the gratuitous use of pain and suffering in stories where it's physical, and it's because we just wince at it. And if you do it too much, you end up numbing the audience to that good and godly impulse to make things better. But there's a more important reason in terms of the language of story, and that's that stories exist to create emotion. The goal of a good story, or of any story, is to make you feel something, right? So bad stories make you feel the wrong things, but they work as stories anyway because they're making you feel something. Stories that don't make you feel anything are actually not working as stories at all. And that's why we say the story is boring. It's not working as a story. It didn't create emotion. The number one thing a story has to do is create emotion in the audience. Emotion is our connection to the external world. It's the low road into your audience's brain rather than the high road. It's not the rational, conceptual where they're piecing things together. And honestly, you want both of them, but your audience wants to feel something. That's what they're there for. So physical pain in Lord of the Rings, we get a few hints of it. You know, Samwise complains about sleeping on a big root. Frodo, you know, with the troll, you know, and the spear. After that, we don't really get a lot of. There's not really much complaining about physical stuff. Why? Because we've moved on to more important things. The emotional pain. Emotional pain is what we're invested in, and that's guilt and loneliness and shame and betrayal and love and joy and things that can often be smashed together. And then here's a little hint: if you want to increase the emotional impact of a scene, juxtapose the emotion that you want with its opposite. Put them together. In I just rewatched. I don't normally talk about this one here, but I just rewatched the scene for different reasons. But it's from Empire of the Sun, Spielberg's movie based on Jim Ballard's story of his being left behind in China during World War II. He was put in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, worked on a runway at a nearby field. They were flying missions. And there's this scene where the boy, Jim, is on top of a building in this camp because the P-51s have come. I mean, the Allies are here to liberate them, right? And the P-51s are just blowing up stuff. And so this boy is on top of the building and he's shouting, jumping up and down, going, P-51s, Cadillac of the sky, horsepower. You know, he's excited. He's just, you can see the joy and you can feel it because, I mean, he's been in a concentration camp and his enemies are now being vanquished by these friends, my countrymen have come for me, or maybe it's the Americans, you know, but it's our friendly people are coming to rescue us. And Spielberg has this great shot where the P-51, where it's of course very Spielbergian, slowed down, and it's not CGI. They actually use P-51s in this shot, but the P-51 flies right by the building that he's on, and the pilot kind of tips the wings towards him and gives him a little wave. And of course he's, you know, ecstatic, right? And the next thing, the camp doctor is up there going, get down, they're blowing everything up. What are you doing, you know? And he runs up there and he grabs Jim. He's like, get down. And Jim says, if we were dead, our bones would be in the runway, because that's what they've been doing with the dead people. You're like, but we're not. We're alive. We get to see this. It's kind of the implication. And the doctor says, try not to think so much. Very human, right? Don't think about that. Try not to think so much. He's actually shaking. Try not to think so much. You feel that as an adult with a child. You don't want them to be thinking about those things. And his response is, I can't remember what my parents look like. That's the dialogue. 3 lines. It's so brilliant. And it's this juxtaposition of the joyous with the heartbreaking together, and it magnifies both of them. The contrast, when you put them together, magnifies both of them. Loss and death. This is sometimes overused in stories. We want people to feel, we want people to cry, so we go straight to death, make the character die. But generally, this doesn't work unless you've really made us love the character first. So the principal thing that I want you to get out of the idea of something to suffer is this principle right here. The suffering that a character endures is going to determine the value of what he or she wants. So it's the story goals that you want them to be invested in. We will be invested in it to the extent that the hero pays a price to get it. And it's really that simple. This dawned on me. I was watching a 60 Minutes or 2020. This was probably 15 years ago, when one of Mickey Mantle's baseball gloves sold at a Sotheby's auction for $293,000 to Billy Crystal, the actor. And I was watching that going, man, some people have too much money. Talk about discretionary income. You're buying a baseball glove because it has Mickey Mantle's sweat stains on it, and you're paying $293,000. It's crazy. No baseball glove is worth it. I could go buy one at a local, Dick's Sporting Goods, which was still in business at the time. I could go buy one for $100 or whatever. And I just couldn't stop thinking about that. I turned the TV off and I was like, why is it worth? And I'm not an economist, so take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. But in storytelling terms, I think this is true, and I think it's actually true in reality. Something is worth the highest price that someone is willing to pay for it. It's the way eBay works. It's the way insurance works. It's the way British common law works. It's the way Sotheby's auctions work, right? It's worth the highest price someone is willing to pay for it. And the reason that stuck with me was because as soon as I had that thought, you may be able to predict the thought that comes next, but that makes me very valuable, makes you very valuable. Again, not to be preachy, but these story principles, what I love about the language of story is that it is constantly pointing back to God and the nature of God, who he is. But unfortunately, some of the modern stories we're getting are concealing those things because they're swapping things out. They're lying to it. They're telling the truth here and lying to us over here. But no, understand this, if you get nothing else from what I just said. In order to make your story goal worth something to the audience, somebody has to pay a price for it. If you've ever read a book or seen a movie where it felt like things were too easy, this is the principle that the storytellers violated. To make the story goal feel valuable, somebody's got to pay for it. And it's love stories are replete with this kind of thing, right? The guy who sacrifices for the girl, or you could say vice versa, but the guy who the champion who lays everything on the line and maybe is even defeated, but he is defeated fighting for it. We consider that noble, right? Because it's actually attaching value to what he loves. And that brings me to something to learn. So this is the fifth element. You can leave this out of a story many times and the audience will still perceive it as a story. But my conviction about this is that if you tell a story not with a moral attached to it, but if you tell a story that has no component of revelation, let's say, the audience will not remember it. No matter how many explosions you have, no matter how interesting the characters are. When I was in graduate school, the last semester that I had, the last book that I read for one of the classes that I was in at the time was The Mosquito Coast, made into a film by Harrison Ford. Brilliant storytelling, brilliant novel, brilliant language. Characters are fascinating. It was particularly difficult for me because I read this in a 24-hour period. We had a lot of reading to do that semester. And so I read it and I was just really engrossed. And I get to the end, and I'm going to do spoilers here because the story won't make sense without it. It's about missionaries on the Mosquito Coast. It's a quirky family, teenage boy and his two parents. And they're cut off from civilization and the radio's broken and they don't have any supplies coming in or whatever. And he goes off. I don't remember exactly what happens in the circumstances. What I remember is when he comes back, his parents are dead on the beach. They're being eaten by birds. And the implication is the boy is going to be eaten by birds too. Weren't his parents stupid? What a meaningless life that we all are subjected to. Even these people who thought that there was meaning in life, you know, they learned better, but did they? Because they died in the end, you know. It's that kind of thing. I threw the book across the room. I was like, you got to be kidding me, right? I got up and I started pacing, and I don't know that I was praying. I was talking to God. I was like, what is the deal with this, right? And I remember this moment where I got over the book and I reached down and I picked it up and I started laughing because it just hit me. The absurdity of this thing. This writer, who's brilliant in his technique, had used meaningful words and meaningful scenes and meaningful characters and meaningful story arcs to try to convince me that meaning doesn't exist. I went, huh? Why? If you don't believe anything is meaningful, why did you write the book? Why was it important to communicate that? So it doesn't work. This principle of meaningless stories. Stories are not stories if they're meaningless. They can't be. Now you can tell a story that you're not quite sure what you're trying to get across with it. That's possible. Lewis would back that up. George MacDonald would back that up. They would say there's, you know, but they're meaningful nonetheless. There's still something there. So we're in a culture war, I think, over the existence of meaning. a couple of years ago during COVID, I took it's the first time I was ever able to do it. I took a class from Robert McKee, the story guy. And he said something really interesting. He said almost word for word, but what I've been saying to people, but that it came out of his mouth was very, very interesting to me. He said, meaning is being removed from our culture. I don't know how or why. And I just stared at the screen for a long time and I thought, Mr. McKee, it's stories. Our stories are being shaped to make it. And I won't go into what else he said because it was just like you're saying it and you don't realize you're saying it. We have an opportunity to make meaningful stories of all different varieties that re-inject the truth of God's story into the world. And I think we're living in a time we're starting to see it with things like, well, yeah, Jesus Revolution, The Chosen. There are other films you guys are involved in. I'm excited to be around for all of this. Practically speaking, meaning is usually a matter of character change, and it's a matter of revelation. So one quick example from this, or maybe two, we'll see how much time I have. Ebenezer Scrooge changes, right? Charles Dickens does not ever tell us that his story is about repentance, but he shows us what repentance is. He doesn't use the word, like salvation in the story. He uses the word Christmas. He imbues Christmas with a redemptive, Christ-like quality to it, ironically, Christ-like, so that when Ebenezer Scrooge says, I will honor Christmas all the year, we see that as a turning point, as real repentance. And the interesting thing about this, that if you, again, this is a really important concept to get from this. A lot of Christian storytelling makes the mistake of trying to tell the audience why they should change. And then they have a character change, but the character change comes too soon. It gives the audience an out. Because if you look at the way Dickens did this, there's not a person in an audience, no matter their religious belief, atheistic, materialistic propensities, when watching A Christmas Carol, nobody sits there and says, yeah, Scrooge is on the right track. Nobody does that. In other words, Dickens proves to us in the audience that Scrooge should change starting on about page 5. If you're reading the novel version, if you look at it, you're watching him the whole time, but he removes every excuse he could possibly have for being on Scrooge's unrepentant side. And by the time, in other words, when Scrooge changes, everybody has already wanted him to change before. He's the last person to give in. Nobody in the audience is still holding out. And that's the principle. You want to show your audience the reasons so strongly without beating them over the head with a moral message or something, that they are relieved. You want them to feel a sense of relief, like, oh, Kirby's going to honor Christmas all the year. I know it's just A Christmas Carol. It's brilliant storytelling. It's why it's survived to today. The same thing holds with a movie where the protagonist is not someone who starts out bad. And I love this film for this reason. It's a Wonderful Life. George Bailey does not start out as a bad guy. He starts out as a good guy, but he's flawed because he believes a lie. And the lie that he believes is that some people live big lives and other people live little lives. And you guys know the movie, I'm sure. When he is shown what the world would be like without his little life, he repents of the belief that the world would be better off if he'd never been born. And Clarence the Angel says, something like, you've left an awful hole. And he, the scene, right, where he runs back to the bridge and he says, I don't care what happens, Clarence, I don't care what happens to me. I want to live again. That line, I don't care what happens to me, I want to live again, is the investment of pure kind of virtue into the character. And the character, we see him as having grown, right? He's become, and he's given the audience, the reason this is powerful, let me say it this way, is because we believe the same lie. We've probably at one point or another believed not just that the world might be better without us, but that big people live big lives, little people live little lives. So if my life seems little right now, what do? I do this yada yada job, and nobody cares, and blah blah. And you can be a Christian and believe these things subtly and internally, and not realize that you have glommed onto a lie, that there's a meaningless life somewhere. or that you're doomed to some kind of meaningless existence. It's not true. And George Bailey reminds us of that. Now, I don't know how much I should know this, but I'm here with none of the materials that I would normally bring, even if I'm planning to do a Zoom thing. So if you guys need to end this like right in 1 minute, I don't know, maybe somebody needs to wave at me or whatever. I have a couple more slides though. Here's things you can do. Make your story about one person. You can have lots of other people in it, but in a film, you predominantly want to have one person. Make sure we know what they want and help us to want the same thing. Make sure there are obstacles in the way. Make sure your protagonist pays a price for it, and make the price steeper than you want it to be. Whatever your inclination is, double it. And then say what changes as a result. What is different? What have we learned? Do we have 15 more minutes, or is it we have like 30 seconds? Maybe someone can type in, or they can like wave at me. Somebody throw something at the screen. So we're done. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. I hope that was helpful. I really appreciate you zooming in here into the circumstances, and is a delight to be with you. I wish I could be there in person.
Okay, thank you all for coming. We have about 5 minutes. We can squeeze in a cup. Hello? Okay, are we here? We have about 5 minutes. We need to be very quick with this. You can ask your question, but don't try to talk back and forth because of technical issues too. So if anybody has a quick question for Daniel. Okay.
How many techniques do you recommend using when writing a story? I know you said not to combine them all. Is it just, do you recommend it? Any certain number?
If you're referring to techniques to make us like a character, you only need one. And you don't necessarily have to use one of them that I put on. The ones that I put on the slide are the most common ones. There are some stories that have been very successful using more than one, 2 or 3. I wouldn't recommend using, like I said, don't try to use all of them unless it's a very long story or you're using them about different characters. You can get us on the side of an ally character, for instance, or even on the side of a villain. Once you've established their villainy, you can kind of make them more human by showing them do something that is maybe a little bit on the heroic side, but we do need some amount of clarity in order to interpret it as a story.
Any other questions? Okay.
I was just going to ask if you could put the other slides up so we could take pictures of them, even if you can't explain it.
Do you mean the ones that I was going to have up?
Yes.
Why don't I don't mind going through them if I can go on here. Do you want to take photos as I go through this? These are the 3 plot types that it would take me another hour to probably go over these, but there are lots of ways of dissecting plot, but this way of seeing plot looks at how the story resolves, and then says it's a boy meets girl because Wesley and Buttercup kiss at the end, basically, or Ebenezer Scrooge honors Christmas, or the heroic quest, the Death Star gets blown up, so it's a heroic quest. And when you can do that, when you recognize the story goal is fulfilled in this way and it makes the audience feel fulfilled, then you can back up and say, what are the steps that usually go into a story of this type? So again, it's not the only way of viewing story, but it is, I think, the most helpful, because it's the 3 things, I would say the 3 main arcs of the storyline of Scripture from Genesis to Revelation. That's why I like it. Again, they're defined by resolution. I'm going to use the whole time going over these. Transformation through repentance. Hero announces their flaws. This one, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings are big ones. Science fiction and fantasy are almost always heroic quest plot types. And it's basically the hero achieving the story goal, but overcoming a series of increasingly difficult obstacles in order to do so. And in doing that, usually the hero changes, their identity changes. Luke Skywalker becomes a Jedi Knight, and it's actually kind of a self-sacrificial thing in the Star Wars movies. This is true. People I think sometimes give themselves too much wiggle room, and if the more you bring the boundaries in, often the more your creative imagination will have fuel to work. Give yourself limitations. In fact, I have on here this slide. I don't have time to read them, but this is from Chuck Jones's rules for the Roadrunner cartoons, right? They actually, before they did a single cartoon, he had these rules, and the rules were, no dialogue ever except to be. So I love this slide because it's like if I were a writer in that writing room and someone handed me this, your temptation or your tendency would be like, how are we going to create anything using these? But it brings the boundaries in so close that the story starts to be the pure thing. It starts inspiring you to make difficult decisions that make the story work. So it's the opposite of what you expect, but oftentimes films would be a little bit better if the director had zoomed in their vision a little bit more. And Jaws is a classic example of this, right? Because the mechanical shark didn't work. You guys know the story. He had to use what? Just suspense shots from the shark's point of view. The simplest thing in the world, and it's what creates all the tension. The mechanical shark isn't really all that scary. And that's the end of it.